Joining us to talk about the impact the protests could have on China's economy is Shehzad Qazi, Managing Director at China Beige Book. Thanks so much for joining us. China's economy is already slowing despite the government's attempts to shore it up. How will the nationwide protests impact the country's growth?
Yeah, the Chinese economy has been under tremendous pressure over the last year and a half or so, and especially due to zero COVID, because the lockdowns have absolutely destroyed domestic demand. And now you're increasingly looking at a slowing export sector with the recession, being talked about for the U.S., Europe already struggling. So these protests are only going to add on to pressures, especially for markets which are trying their best to rally on hopes of zero COVID ending, but are being met repeatedly with the much more tough reality of neither zero COVID going away, nor there being any sign of the Chinese economy rebounding anytime soon.
Well, Shehzad, political watchers have described this as the most serious challenge since the Tiananmen Square protests. What would be the blowback be on China's economy and finance if the authorities decide to crush the opposition?
Look, I mean, if President Xi decides to go in hard, that's obviously going to spook investors for sure. Now, the economic question at the end of the day is tied to the lockdown policy by and large. If the president decides to be even more aggressive towards lockdowns, and you see factories being shut down or being under limited production, you get port closures again, you're talking about very serious supply chain logjams reemerging from China. Now, rather than playing the guessing game, it's always best to see how this will be handled. But I think any type of aggressive move will only continue to further spook markets as it's done overnight.
Shehzad, MNCs such as Apple and investment banks have diversified their manufacturing bases out of China or scaled back their staff strength. Do you see more foreign companies stepping up such moves? And what would that impact be on China?
Yeah, I think what the Foxconn factory lockdowns and the protests that started there have shown us is that supply chain diversification needs to be taken very, very seriously at the corporate headquarters of major manufacturers across the United States and other countries. I think certain attempts have been made. I'm not sure, though, that these companies have fully priced in how they need to be approaching supply chain management and diversification in their, for their individual companies. That absolutely will be something that will happen more and more, I think. That has to do with geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and China. I think some amounts of supply chain decoupling will only grow over the coming years, especially as tech restrictions, et cetera, get stricter from the U.S. side.
Well, some analysts are betting that China could further ease COVID-19 curbs to cool the situation. Would that be the best case scenario for the economy?
I'm not particularly sure that is going to be the best case unless you introduce mRNA vaccines. The real question right now is that how soon can China introduce mRNA vaccines, and how soon can they inoculate enough of the population, especially in urban centers, that allows them to back off this rather draconian lockdown policy that is really, quite frankly, the only alternative. That's the game changer right there. Beyond, if you don't have vaccines in place and you don't have inoculations and booster campaigns, opening up is going to lead to widespread disaster. You're talking about millions of deaths, millions and millions of hospitalizations. I think that will create far more chaos than what you're seeing at the moment.
Shehzad, any estimates on what the hit would be to manufacturing and consumption should the protests persist, say, for a week or even longer?
Look, the next week or a few weeks may not be as dire, although I think the economy generally is under a lot of strain as it is. So the data will probably continue to look negative. But if there is staying power here, and we're looking at some kind of, long-term street battles happening between protesters and Chinese authorities, that really clouds the economic outlook. I mean, 2022 has been pretty weak. I think 2023 will start off on a much weaker note at that point.
Thank you, Shehzad. That was Shehzad Qazi, Managing Director at China Beige Book.